Good morning, everyone. My name is Barb Ryan, and I'm Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council, and I'm delighted to be here again at GeoIgnite 2022. We were here in 2021 and very much enjoyed our association with the organizers, so I'd like to thank them again, and of course all the people in the audience. I'm here today to talk about GHG monitoring from space and the importance of leveraging commercial capabilities. And I'll use as an example for this entire talk some work that we did this last year. It resulted in the report that you see there, a joint report by GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, Climate Trace, that's former U.S. Vice President Albert Gore's organization, and WattTime, it was their operating arm or project managers as part of Climate Trace, and then of course WGIC, the organization that I'm involved with. I'll just tell you that the context for this entire effort really was an outgrowth of a high-level dialogue that was held back in December of 2020 in the lead up to COP26, the Conference of the Parties, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties that was going to be held in Glasgow, Scotland. The UK high-level climate champion Nigel Topping and Al Gore got together and said, well, it would be good if we could actually have a dialogue on what we can do from space. So there were about 100 people there, scientists, policymakers, government officials, academicians, and an outgrowth of that dialogue was, why don't we just try and look at a narrow suite of constituents that are in fact being measured from space and bring the private sector capabilities to bear. So for many of you in the audience may know that there's a group called the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, or CS. In fact, CSA is a member of that organization. And for decades, actually, they've compiled something called a MIM database, Measurements, Instruments, and Missions database, that shows what all the public space agencies around the world are doing. So we leveraged that database for the public sector and then said, hey, using that idea in the public sector, why don't we do an assessment and a call for what's being done in the private sector? Now, we selected a very narrow range of constituents. It was only the 3 greenhouse gases that are, say, formally recognized by the convention, and that's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and put the data together. Now, this graph is a little bit small to see, but clearly all the details of this in the database, this is just a schematic of the database, are in the report. And what we found from that exercise is that in total, there were 33 missions, 21 on the public side, so really about 2/3 on the public side. 13 were in orbit, 7 in development, and 1 was an end of life. On the private sector side, there were 7 total, 1 in orbit and operational. That's actually a Canadian and British company called GHG 1 in orbit and testing, that's Orbital Sidekick. I don't believe data is forthcoming from that mission yet. And 5 in development. And then lastly, and very interestingly, we discovered 5 hybrid missions. So this is some combination of public resources and private resources and or philanthropic resources that are coming together to, in fact, address this issue. So again, a narrow suite, just those 3 greenhouse gases that are recognized by the convention. But the real interesting part is, to the best of our knowledge, it's the first systematic mapping of GHG missions from space across public, private, and hybrid missions. And so these next couple slides will just show you a little bit in more detail what we found. So first of all, if we look at those missions, by country, you'll see this. So the public missions are shown in blue, the private missions are shown in red, and those hybrid missions are shown in green. And so if we look just at Canada, you will see that it's that private sector mission that I told you about, GHG SAT. If we look at that same data, but by mission status, what you will see is, again, the colors stay the same throughout these entire graphs. Public are in blue, private are in red, and hybrid missions are shown in gray. So in orbit, it's largely those public sector missions, with just the two that I referenced from the private sector side. And yet when we look at what's in development, you'll see it's about a third, a third, a third. So public, private, and hybrid missions are in development. And then, of course, you can see that one end-of-life mission, which was a public mission. If we take that same data and look at it across time, I find this just really quite exciting. So in the 1990s all the way to the 2000s, 100% of those missions were public sector missions. As we came into 2011 to 2020, what you saw is the entrance or the emergence of those private sector missions. And as we look at the next decade, so 2021 to 2030, you'll actually see kind of a nice mix between public, private, and hybrid missions. Now, again, I want to be clear, this is just for those GHG gases that can be monitored from space. So let's look at that. If we look at CO2, methane, and then nitrous oxide, you'll see that you'll see the split among those gases. Those the both in orbit and planned or in development missions have now been consolidated for this portrayal. So again, blue in public, private in red, and hybrid in gray. And if we take a look at the spatial resolution of those, you'll see kind of a nice mix for those point source collections between the public sector, private sector, and hybrid missions. As you increase your spatial view to national and or global, you'll see a migration towards those public sector missions. And that really has been the historic strength of those public sector missions, is that they are in fact collecting data globally, everywhere around the world, but often at a more coarse resolution. So the benefit of these private sector missions and really leveraging those commercial capabilities is that we're bringing in higher spatial, spectral in some cases, or temporal resolutions. And so the combination of both public sector and private sector missions is just really important if we're going to address the challenges that are facing us with climate change. Now, again, this was the first systematic mapping. What we were really quite happy about is that we were given an opportunity to present these findings at the Earth Information Day. So it's a day just dedicated to Earth observations that is held during the Conference of the Parties. And so we, WGIC, were actually asked to present on behalf of the private sector at the Conference of the Parties. So we were quite excited about that because clearly we want to be able to bring more private sector capabilities to bear on these climate negotiations. So again, the partnership with GEO, who also traditionally has presented at Earth Information Day, Climate Trace, and then WGIC. So some key policy messages that emerged from this report are that certainly satellite observations reduce uncertainty in GHG monitoring. And so by providing this data across a range of spatial, temporal, or spectral resolutions is just really important. So that specifically speaks to the role of the private sector coming in with increased capabilities. Government Space agencies have the capability to collect national and global data. I mentioned that before. They've been doing it for a long time and hopefully will continue to do it. They need resources as well. The private sector companies are increasingly coming into the market in this area. We saw the emergence of hybrid missions. This is something that we didn't anticipate before. We thought there would be just public sector and private sector missions, but I think this is a really nice evolution to see that these public-private partnerships that are emerging globally are actually being strengthened. It's not just the public sector contracts with the private sector, but under these true public-private partnerships, what you're seeing is both parties bringing their data to resources to the table. Clearly, collaboration, innovation, and financing are just key levers for GHG monitoring. On the public sector side, open data, open science, and open knowledge is absolutely essential. We recognize that the private sector has different business models. Not all their data is open, though we're seeing increasingly data being open for conservation purposes or to selected research communities. And I think over time, we may actually see a migration away from data being the currency in the private sector, but actually services being the currency. Now, again, we may not see that for 5, 10, or 15 years, but I do think there's an evolution in that way. And clearly, new opportunities are arising for analyzing both secondary remote sensing measurements. And so we always want to remind the parties that in situ measurements are important for certainly areas that you can't measure from space, and all the evolutions that are taking place on the information technology side are so critical. So the recommendation that we made back to the Conference of the Parties is that based on these findings, we really must call for continued cooperation between the public and private sector to fully maximize those complementarities and synergies to support the race to zero as we go forward. So that's the entire report. I think what I would like to do is just end with a couple slides about WGIC, because it makes a strong argument for an organization like WGIC that can gain entree to not only the Conference of the Parties for Climate, but for any of the other international treaties and negotiations are out there. These are international treaties where the governments are in fact the parties. And for the private sector to get any kind of meaningful voice, they generally have to go up through their respective governments. And what I'm arguing is that we also need another way in. So trade associations like WGIC that can in fact consolidate a voice on behalf of the whole private sector are important in these international deliberations, as it was shown in this GHG. So while we're a global not-for-profit trade association working in the geospatial sector, we've got three primary strategic goals. Clearly, we want to strengthen the contributions of the geospatial industry to society and the global economy at large, as evidenced by this work with GHG monitoring. We want to advance global policy matters, and as a trade association, we definitely want to create business opportunities. How we got into this entire effort is that we have adopted climate as an overarching target, and we've got 3 specific working groups on disaster resilience, energy transition, and sustainable infrastructure. And so to the extent that any of you in the audience are interested in joining us in that effort, we would welcome that. Currently, our members are shown here. A couple of the members are actually at GeoIgnite and or sponsors of GeoIgnite. Both Maxar and Planet will be having keynote talks as well. And GHGSat is the Canadian and British company that I told you about, with the only company that's delivering GHG data from space right now. Policy work is in 3 areas, whether it was the protection of personal privacy or public-private partnerships that I alluded to, and geospatial, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. We are just about to issue a report on digital twins, and I'd like to give you this website because we would love to have you join us at the report launch for digital twins. So thank you very much for your time. If you are a private sector company anywhere from startups all the way to the biggest companies that are there, we would love to talk to you about joining WGIC. Again, thank you to the organizers and very much appreciate all your attention. I'll look forward to the questions and answers that'll go live after this talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. Thanks for joining us again. It's very exciting to have you with us. You were a keynote last year. We love working with the WGIC, just a fantastic organization. Thank you for being a silver sponsor.
You're most welcome, John. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we love having you. So the Q&A is open. I always take full advantage and like to ask a few questions myself to start us off. Something that struck me in one of the graphs that you presented was what looked to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like the lion's share of some of the work was being done by the USA predominantly, then looked like Europe and China was a bit of a surprise to me on the chart that I saw. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the USA? Like, I guess the surprise to me was China, like who's actually interested in looking at this and why?
Yeah, it's too bad I can't pull up that graph right now, John, but no, the United States with NASA's historic investment in this particular area, largely NASA, maybe a little bit of NOAA financing has been there right from the beginning. With China, as you can imagine, it's a little difficult getting some data out of there. But was there a mission or two from China, or were they absent altogether?
It was the bar graph of just the amounts of, I guess, the missions.
The number of
which
missions.
Countries were doing that. Yeah, it was like one of the very first graphs.
Yeah. Okay. But China was on the map. That's what you're saying. There was one mission that was coming out of there. Yeah. I can't, you know what, honestly, I'm not sure I have that specific information on the name of the mission in front of me, but we definitely can provide it. Okay. I think what we were surprised at is we actually thought there might be more missions from Asia in general than actually made that table. So it does seem to be kind of a European and North American biased table in that regard.
And if you had to give Canada a grade, how have we been doing?
Oh, well, very good. Very good, because I realized as I was watching that presentation, it was pre-recorded, but Canada was mentioned in another place on a hybrid mission later on. It wasn't just the GHG sat, but the fact that you emerged with GHG, I mean, I know it's a Canadian and British company. That's the one satellite that's collecting GHG data right now from space.
Yeah, that is exciting. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about, we'll do a little bit of its Canadian story. Can you tell us a little bit about, they're a member of the WGIC. Share a little bit about them.
Yeah, and let me just do that in a way that sets up kind of a teaser for an event that's going to be on Thursday the 10th. So that's a week from this Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning. And actually you're going to get, if you join us in that workshop, there are two things. We've broadened it, not just GHG data, but any contributions for climate change that can be observed from space. And what you're going to see is actually every WGIC member that's space-based or a satellite company is going to be there. So Maxar will come in and talk about what they're doing. GHGSat will be there. Planet will be there. So I know those are the two companies that you've got keynotes from. And then also two other companies, Satellogic and also Satellite View, a new member to WGIC is Satellite View, and it's got an entirely different suite of constituents, this side on the thermal side. So again, we would love to have you join that event where you could hear individually from each of those presenters, and GHGSat will be there.
Absolutely. Maybe we could get a link put in the chat if it hasn't been put there already by one of the team members. That would be great.
Perfect.
Sent out to the audience. We've got a question that's come in on the Q&A. I'll read it out. It's from Jeff Zeiss. GHGSat is not selling imagery, but measurements of CH4 emissions for factories, small towns, etc. This is selling a service rather than data, and this is totally commercial operation. Is this the trend of the future?
Yeah. Great question, Jeff. And I actually think it is. And I alluded to that in my remarks. Right now, by and large, and actually you heard Dan talk about that a little bit in his keynote this morning, data is still largely the currency of exchange on the private sector side, but we are seeing companies start to go into services and then sell that services. I personally think it's going to be a trend in the future. Let me just say one other thing, because it actually builds on some of the work that GHGSat is doing. They're actually working with emitters, so polluters out there that they're engaging with and saying, listen, here are measurements that we're taking from space. And many of those companies are actually quite interested in that. One, I think deeply, they do want to, in fact, reduce their emissions, but their records may not be as accurate. So this is a great QA/QC on the entire system. So anyway, thanks, Jeff, for that question.
Yeah, I've got another one. You remarked on the surprise you had that you found these hybrid missions. That was, it was a surprise. Why was it a surprise, and why do you think it's becoming a bit of a, maybe is it becoming a trend?
Yeah, I think it is becoming a trend. And it was a surprise for me for a couple different reasons. One, I've spent most of my career, 40 plus years on the public sector side. This is the first time, with our not-for-profit with WGIC, where I've gotten really great insights into the private sector side. And I think it was kind of black and white. It's either public sector missions or private sector missions. So that was one reason. Maybe I was just looking at it too narrowly, but and I alluded to it in our remarks. In fact, Prashant Shukla was the lead researcher. We issued a report on public-private partnerships. And while there's tremendous capability, I think the dynamics are that we're still largely in the government issues contracts for which the private sector applies for those contracts. And so it's a really strict just contractor relationship. And so when we saw these philanthropic and public sector and private sector actually bring their own resources to the table in a true partnership, I was surprised, because this whole report we had done kind of alluded to the fact that we're looking hard to find truly meaningful public-private partnerships. Prashant, in a session that he's going to moderate this afternoon, we may go into that a little bit more, and he may have a different view on that. But I was surprised personally.
You mentioned philanthropy there. Is there a lot of philanthropy? Like, I'm imagining, pops into my head the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation putting money into things.
Yeah, in this particular case, the one that comes to mind right off the top of my head is the Environmental Defense League, Environmental Defense Foundation, who's working with a company called Scepter Air for a methane sat mission that's I think scheduled for launch in the maybe 2023, 2024 timeframe, something like that. Okay, they're out seeking additional phases of their funding right now.
Okay. We've got more time for Q&A. So I mentioned the audience, put your questions in the Q&A. I'd like to pivot a little bit, and you've got a workshop in the workshop week. Could you give us a bit of a preview about what that's going to be about and who should attend?
Yeah, so anybody that's interested in the contribution that space-based companies can make, or satellite companies, to the entire domain of climate change, whether it's reducing emissions, whether it's characterizing those efforts, whether it's going into, adaptation and mitigation efforts. We've extended an invitation to all of the WGIC members who are space-based companies, and they're going to be talking about their offerings at that workshop. So while we started out with just GHG SAT and our GHG monitoring, and of course GHG SAT will be there, we decided to broaden it to include more than just those greenhouse gases and any of the observations that are being taken from space that can, in fact, help advance and influence the race to zero.
Fantastic.
So 10 o'clock, March 10th at 10 o'clock in the morning on your site.
Fantastic. We've got a question coming in from Melanie. Understanding that many subscription-based models may be focused in highly populated areas, can you provide any insights on what GHG services may emerge monitoring effects of thawing permafrost in the north?
Yeah, so let me just first of all, thanks, Melanie, for that, because we WGIC have just put a paper together. The lead author on it is Pooja Mahapatra from Fugro, a WGIC member. She's going to be presenting that paper at the upcoming Arctic Observing Summit. And I can tell you that we're making the same argument to the Arctic Observing Summit people that we made to the UNFCCC, is that the private sector writ large has tremendous capabilities to make. In this case, and to your question, whether it's from space and or on the ground, monitoring of infrastructure and the destruction that takes place to that infrastructure and or people and or the environment from a thawing permafrost. That paper will be presented in a couple weeks at the Arctic Observing Summit. So the paper's not quite out for release right now, but I'd point you to that paper and also your participation in that Arctic Observing Summit.
Fantastic. Well, that takes us almost right to the break. Barb, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with, a key thought?
Yeah. Well, and John, thanks. And thanks to you and your team, because the reason we did come back actually is that it's a great venue. And of course, we really want to make a special plea to other Canadian companies to join WGIC. But for me, the key point is that with issues as serious to the whole planet, like climate change, it's no longer sufficient to just utilize public sector resources to fight this issue. There are tremendous capabilities that exist on the private sector side, and we've just got to do a better job of bringing those to bear on this entire issue of responding to climate change and the host of other issues that are related to that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I would definitely encourage any companies to take a good look at joining the WGIC, an important organization doing important work. Love all the things that have been the work on policy that's been coming out. It's really been fantastic to see. No more work needs to be done, but it's good to see what has been done. So that's going to take us to the break. I will see everybody on the other side in 15 minutes. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Barb.